I'd like to move to some rounds of questions and comments from the audience. Please be brief, about a minute each, and please also introduce yourself, which I believe I forgot to do at the beginning, so I shall set a good example. I'm Andy Norton, I'm Director of Research for ODI. Now, I'd like to collect 2 or 3 questions through. We have 2 in the middle here, 1 there, and then I'll go to the edges. Would you like to start? Thank you.
So, I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's working. So my name is Ricardo Santos, and I'm a DPhil student at IDS. And having been in East Timor for 1 year, there are some things that don't surprise me about what happens and the role that East Timor has in the G7+. But I would like to congratulate this initiative and the initiative of starting to put yourselves in a very uncomfortable position of defining yourselves as fragile states. It's already bad enough to be defined as developing countries, as if the others already developed and know how to do it. Recognizing yourselves as a country that has some difficulties and challenges in providing the services to the people is something else. But again, East Timor is used to being in uncomfortable positions and getting better. I would like to highlight this point of G7 being a forum for learning, but also to get a new voice and to be a forum where countries that can be looked a little bit badly have a voice in development, and that's a very good thing. Dialogue and participation, and one of the things that was said by Henry Smith, and the importance of listening to their own people. Yes, it's a big challenge. Hopefully, the participatory methods being adopted by you will be very important, and hopefully they will teach something to other countries that are facing challenges of listening to their own people, namely what's happening here in the riots in the UK, but also in Greece and in other countries facing some crisis. And the final thing that I learned from East Timor is patience. Patience and not to rush doing the right thing. Portugal did a very bad thing. Rushing to do a very good thing was giving independence to all the countries in one go without giving support, the needed support to the countries in their process. The consequence of that was a 35 years process of independence that East Timor have to last it. And if they were to give up on that process when the first president died, the first leader of the resistance died, at this moment Xanana would not be the president of East Timor. So learn a little bit from that, and have patience in this process of graduating from fragile states.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, my name is Eric Gutierrez. I'm governance advisor at Christian Aid. I mean, like some of the people who have spoken, I do wish that G7+ will get the political commitment that they're aspiring for in the Busan conference. So all the best and best. Now, looking at the framework that you presented in terms of what can be done and how it can be started, I think one of the key issues or key points that need to be put on the tables is that at every step of the way in those 5 PSGs that you mentioned, there will be dilemmas that will be difficult to deal with. So, for example, one dilemma is how do you deal with the non-state actors in the various different countries? In some countries, for example, if you want to build bridges and roads, you may and you want to do it in places beyond the military checkpoints, then you may have to deal with the non-state actors as contractors. And are donors going to agree or to even consider that kind of an arrangement where aid money is going to be given to non-state actors for some piece of development work? There's a lot of issues. I think it's not about transparency, but more about corruption. And if some in a lot of countries, corruption can bring down a government. But in many of the fragile states, sometimes corruption is necessary to keep a government's hold on power. If they start cracking down on corruption, they might lose support from some of the members of the coalition that support them. So, how do you deal with that dilemma? How do you approach it? Is it just a matter of sequencing that you put something for later? And then, another key point is, I think, is land, because in a lot of the fragile states, the real driver of conflict is conflict over land, and a lot of the peace agreements being developed have not really put into, how do we deal with land issues in the DRC, how do we deal with land issues in Angola and in many other places. So it's really commendable that the discussion has gone to this point. But I think maybe the next step that needs to be defined, is how do we deal with those dilemmas? There are no hard and fast rules and answers to it, but I think it's better to put them on the table. These are the dilemmas. We don't have the answers. If anybody can try to figure out what the answers could be, then let's take it on. So yeah.
Enrico, thank you very much. Those very rich comments.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah. Thank you. I'm not sure it's working. Is it?
It's okay.
Okay. Sophie Hasperslag from Conciliation Resources. We're also a participant in the international dialogue on peace building and state building. So thank you very much, Helder, for coming all the way and sharing your thoughts with us. I was going to say this morning, but it's definitely lunchtime because I can hear my stomach grumbling. Just a few brief thoughts, really. I think from our perspective, what was incredibly new and positive about this international dialogue is really what Helder and others were saying on the panel was about a dialogue, a real dialogue between partner governments, development actors, donors, and civil society actors, really for a year long, basically having these exchanges and discussions. And I really think that the peace building and state building goals are really a huge achievement coming out of that exchange and the dialogue. And so I think when it comes to the New Deal document, I guess from a civil society perspective, I guess I'm going to Busan as well, and I'm very aware that in these kind of big shebang donor conferences and big meetings where you have to reach a political deal and an agreement, there's going to be one thing that sticks. There's going to be one catchphrase, there's going to be one big idea. And if the New Deal is the big idea, I guess my kind of comment would be today is that what would be really great would be to really bring in the peace building and state building goals into this New Deal, so that the New Deal, because as the draft stands at the moment, the New Deal is quite focused on a New Deal between, I guess, recipient and donors. So it's about how to improve that. How can we have a New Deal that's also about state-society relations? How can we bring into the New Deal the peace building and state building goals and really make it into one strong package? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie. I'm going to go back to the panel for anyone who wants to pick up points quickly that were raised there and go in the reverse way. Marcus, you're not going to pick up anything, Henry? No. Cohen, would you like to pick up any of the comments made from the floor?
Yes, I'd love to. Well, first of all, thank you for those points. I think, Sophie from Conciliation Resources, we heard your point, and we've listened very carefully. On Enrico's points, the dilemmas, unfortunately some of the dilemmas were lost because there was a police car going past the ODI office, and I heard more of that than of the dilemmas. But I did get the gist of it, and the gist is basically this is very hard work. And I would like to point to actually Marcus's points earlier on risk. Risk should never walk alone. Risk should always be in combination with reward, with results, with management, and I think there are no universal solutions to a lot of the dilemmas in these contexts. I think, though, you can learn a lot from other cases. For instance, Afghanistan, I worked a lot on that. In a difficult environment, it is possible to work on the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, to bring in monitoring agents and to do things which really restrict the opportunities for corruption. It's just an example. I point to the paper that Marcus and Alistair McKechnie produced, which I think was very helpful in this regard. And sharing these examples in a platform like the G7+, because I think that is, in the end, the innovation of the G+, leaders sitting together and learning things, and also talking to their civil societies on these issues. And there we should be open to innovation in the sense that it's not always either or. To point to the point of that Marcus raised about whether the government or whether donors should provide healthcare, I've seen plenty of examples where it's in between, where an NGO provides healthcare within the framework of government policies, for instance. It happens that way in my own country. Why shouldn't it happen that way in Afghanistan? So I think we should be open to learning lessons and innovations which help us deal with, indeed, the very difficult dilemmas. And on the just one point I wanted to highlight from the panel discussion, because I hadn't had the chance before, I think the issue of brain drain that Marcus raised is incredibly important. I've seen it in every single context I've worked in. There is competition for the brightest people, and it really makes it very hard to build government capacity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Colin. On that last point, I've never really understood why it was impossible to get agreement on an incentive package that was a level playing field between different agencies. But anyway, Helder, one particular point, the framework for non-state actors. Do you have any particular observations on that from the experience in Timor-Leste or other points that were raised from the floor?
Thank you. I was about to jump into answering that question, but I'll let my other distinguished panelists have us go first. Thank you. Yes, for us, let me just bring to you the experience of Timor-Leste. We put a lot of emphasis in the state and non-state actors. For those who have been to Timor, if you travel outside Dili, you'll see that, but not much happening. But hang on, if you look carefully, the role of civil society is very vocal. In fact, I keep saying this to them. You guys, you are not elected directly by the people, but you are the most vocal, the most proliferate civil society organization that I've ever come across with. So, capitalizing the knowledge and experience and also the proactiveness in providing inputs to the government, and they're very active in criticizing government openly through media, through workshops and so on. So for us, the non-state actors in Timor-Leste is composed, people sometimes also mention of the parliamentary in the non-state, but it's not. Parliamentary is the most legitimate body in any country, and they are the ones who, by the way, approve the budget to be implemented. But all I'm saying here is that the civil society for outside non-state actors, including the youth, women's organization, women network, they are very powerful in my country. An example that the Timor-Leste government is doing now is this. When we launched the strategic development plan recently under the leadership of the Prime Minister, because Prime Minister last year, he went around all the 65 sub-districts, consulted with the people, and then he came up and then drafted the so-called strategic development plan for the next 20 years. So we now have a vision, a plan for that. That's why for Timor-Leste, when we implement this, we will ask our donors, development partners, to work with us, together with the other the three main components of state and non-state actors, namely the government, development partners, and civil society and private sector. So 4 components are working together, and that's why during the Timor-Leste Development Partners meeting, annual meeting in July this year, we came up with the so-called DDP, Dili Development Pact, which ties everybody together, and then we commit to invest in Timor-Leste with one vision, one plan, and one shared responsibilities. That's what I can share this with you through the ODI website if you like, but that document is publicly available in the G7 Plus as well. And we're very proud to be able to come up and then getting the buy-in, getting the active participation of our civil society organizations. I do take the point that sometimes civil society, it's not criticism, right? Sometimes I keep mentioning to this, that civil society in Timor-Leste context, they act as if they are elected body from the people. You know? They are not. Right? You are part of the partnership of any civil society or any components of any society in any given country, that you are able, by all means you can provide your inputs, feedback to the government, but you are not elected. The government doesn't need to respond directly to you, but the government responds to the representatives of your people, which in this case is the parliament. That's the conversation that we have in our own country. Huh? So I hope this brings that little experience from Timor-Leste to this audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to pick up one more round of questions quickly. And again, if you could keep them short, that would be great. And I'll go in this line here, if you could start.
Hi. My name's Paul Harvey. I'm the director of something called the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, which is a ODI-led, DFID-funded program that will be researching livelihoods and access to services in fragile and conflict-affected situations over the next 6 years. So hopefully we'll be producing evidence that will help inform the post-Busan work. Well, at the moment we're in a starting point of that, and we've been reviewing the available literature on fragile and conflict-affected situations. And there are clearly many gaps, but I think two sprung to mind here that I was going to sort of ask the panel about. One of which is around a good independent analytical literature of what governments do in relation to, particularly to supporting livelihoods and supporting economic growth. The international aid industry is very good at analysing, monitoring, evaluating itself. But I think part of relating back to Helder's point about building trust, to build trust more effectively, good independent analysis of what governments do would be very valuable, and I think is a missing area. Related to that, I think the second point of gaps is how capacities are built or indeed undermined. So much of international aid is premised around the idea of building government capacity to hand over responsibility for delivering services or supporting livelihoods. But then the nuts and bolts of how that process of capacity building works seems oddly underanalyzed. So I guess the question for the panel is, are those the right sort of questions, and would evidence around those be useful in developing the post-Busan work that you'll be taking forward?
Thank you very much, Paul. At the front here, and then we'll go to the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Rebecca Engel, and I'm with the Center for International Conflict Resolution at Columbia University, but I'm also a doctoral candidate here at SOAS. And I also want to echo what some of our colleagues here have said, which is that this is actually representative of great progress. And I started working with Helder even in 1997, and moved and opened an office in Timor in 2002. And in those days, we were fighting essentially with the World Bank to even use the terminology conflict prevention. They said there is no conflict prevention, this is development. So there is, I think this is a great step forward to even be having these issues on the table and in the forefront. And I wanted to maybe ask a bit more explicitly about something that was raised implicitly about economic policy, macroeconomic policy, and how much are the structural assumptions about economic policy being discussed in terms of equitable development and in terms of assumptions about where is privatization and market-driven, private sector-driven development useful to what extent, and where is it actually not? And looking back at the agriculture sector in East Timor, for example, looking at Timor-Leste, the policies that were prescribed in the early days of between 2000 and 2002, looking at private, bringing in a lot of imported agricultural products, not providing support to the agriculture sector and such things, and how that potentially did have a negative impact on state-society relations and expectations of the society, of the state, and et cetera. So I wonder to what extent those details are being discussed in terms of how conflict dynamics are driven by some of these macroeconomic policies. Sorry.
Rebecca, thank you very much. One at the back and then one here. Can you take about a minute each, please, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you. Anke Höfler, University of Oxford. Let me ask something really fundamental about what sort of vision you've got in mind for state building, and what sort of a model of a state you've got in your heads. Is it how to go from chaos to Denmark? Denmark is a strong state, but Denmark has got a lot of restrictions on its sovereignty. No own currency, the European Court, and so on. So is this sort of something you've got in mind? In how far is sovereignty going to be restricted for those sort of fragile countries that are getting stronger? And how do these sort of state building visions of the sort of newer donors fit in, like China and the Middle East, who've certainly got a very different state experience of their own? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think one last question here, just quickly.
Thank you. I just want to know how you measure aid effectiveness or development effectiveness in a country where there's a huge gap between socio-economic conditions that have been actually created by oppressive regimes like Sri Lanka, where even humanitarian action plan for UN has not been even endorsed by the governments, where when there have been 500,000 IDPs who have been refused aid, the access to aid agents, ICRC, UN agents, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Oh yes, there is also a question online. Not a question, but a comment, and this is from Jehunita Matthews-Freeman, the UK representative for the European Federation of Liberian Associations. The presentation by Mr. Da Costa was very encouraging, great for those much needed steps, great that these fragile states can see each step towards progress. So an encouragement from someone in Liberia. Okay, let's move back to the panel at this point, and again, I think I'll move back through the panel. We've had points about supporting livelihoods and growth, points about, if you like, the economic model and how that impacts on particularly liberal economic policies, and how that builds on, or how that builds towards the peace building and state building goals. And also, I think, an interesting question about what the model is and how we see the models is affected by the emergence of, if you like, emerging donors and emerging powers, new players in the aid scene. Marcus, do you want to say anything at the end of the discussion?
Paul, I think you're right. I think the two research areas you've got would be good ones, and I think it would be very helpful to have more information on both of those. Rebecca, I think why I think the peace and state building goals are so powerful is it gives you a framework to look at whatever policies or whatever proposals are being put in place, because you can then say, well, how will this help deliver on security? And I think that's a short answer to a much longer question. And I think that's why it's such an important first step. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Henry?
Well, a couple of quick responses. I think, Paul, your question, I would say that, yes, they sound really interesting as areas of further research, but I'd say another one of them is really trying to get to grips with this business of what normal people in affected countries really think about their safety and security and access to justice and so on, and then look at how you go about finding it out. I mean, there's a really interesting kind of methodological question, I think, about how you access the information, and then you feed that information in, and then how you feed that information into processes, because it's not just about elections. I mean, elections are important, but they're a feature of an open society where, and a form of democracy and so on. But there are lots of other important ways in which people should be able to express their views, and so I think that's trying to get to grips with, if we're taking a serious approach to addressing the issues which affect normal people significantly in conflict and fragile conflict-affected and fragile countries, then we need to work out how to find that information out. And I think there's a real deficit there. And I think the point, just that the lady that said the final question about how to measure progress. I mean, I don't have an answer, of course. I mean, it's incredibly complicated and difficult. But I would say that if I understood what you're saying, what you've identified there, I think, is one of the reasons why I think it's really important that, for example, the compacts that feature in this New Deal document at the moment aren't just between the government of a country and the donors involved in the country, because sometimes, I mean, obviously not in the case of Timor-Leste, but in some cases, governments aren't necessarily representative of all their populations and don't have their best interests in mind. And so if the compact kind of by implication excludes a large proportion of the population who may well be the most vulnerable people in that population, then that's probably not going to do them any good in the long run. So I do think that it kind of the point you're raising reinforces the importance of looking at how you involve a wider as possible section of perspectives and views in a particular society. And just a very quick final thing, if I just respond to one of the points that Helder made. you know, I very much agree. No one elects civil society organisations. We shouldn't assume that kind of role within a society. And actually, it should. If we place ourselves in between normal people and government, then that's probably a bad thing for everybody. But I don't think, you know, I think sometimes there's in certain places that I've worked in, certainly there's civil society organisations have been used as a bit of a proxy for not involving normal people, because it's, you know, it's kind of them or us type of thing, and it actually shouldn't be. It should be a slightly different discussion, I think.
Thank you very much, Henry. Cohen, would you like to make any comments at the end?
Yes, 3 points in response to the comments, for which I'm very grateful. First of all, on the model of whether we have a model of a state in mind, I think all of us on the panel have been stressing context, so the answer would be no. But of course, there's an interplay here between looking at the world top-down and trying to learn general lessons, and looking at it bottom-up and trying to think of what works best in a certain context. I do think that the state-building goals and peace-building goals are very useful in pointing to the need to think of justice, to think of security, to think of prosperity, basically. And I also think, in terms of context, it's very important to once again underline that the World Development Report stressed the regional context for fragility so much. On involving newer donors or the not-so-usual suspects, that's incredibly important, and they will be involved in Busan, and I think we should continue our dialogue with them. The second point on the economic model, I would agree with Marcus and say that we have a framework here and a partnership that could potentially discuss a lot of things that are relevant. I point to the fact that Timor-Leste has been playing a very important role in the EITI Transparency Initiative, which is so important because, of course, many of these countries face the risk of dealing with natural resources in such a way that it undermines accountability instead of enhancing it. So I do think there is space for dealing with these issues, but it again depends on the context. Finally, on capacity building and potential research, I'd just like to point to the very useful civilian capacity review that took place within the UN context, and the follow-up that the UN system is now giving to that, led by Sarah Cliff. And I think it would be useful to look at that in the coming time, because that could be very useful in piloting some issues. We've had difficulty that needs assessments haven't focused on capacity issues, and therefore peacekeeping missions or political missions haven't focused on it. While this should be front and center of any international effort to support national efforts in post-conflict situations. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Cohen. Helder, I think you should have the last word. I think you can take from this meeting a great deal of support for the basic idea of a new aid deal for conflict-affected and fragile states. I would just like to comment at the end that the kind of political currents in the traditional donors are maybe more challenging for using country systems now than they've been at any time in the last 10 years. So in terms of the challenges that have been laid out, and many of these are not new challenges, but kind of old and well-rehearsed dysfunctions in the system, the how of getting there will be as important as identifying what. But I think there is a great deal of support from here for the new element in this initiative, which is the very strong political leadership from fragile states themselves. Would you like to say some words to close and any responses to the comments?
Thank you. Well, it's beyond my expectation to listen to the quality comments that you all have given to us. I'll take away from this forum, and in fact next week we will meet in Juba among the G7+. I'll brief my minister on what happens since Paris today and so on. What I can take away from here is that yes, there is a sense of great support that the world has changed. The political landscape and aid landscape also has changed. We are now talking about moving to development effectiveness. And some people talk about the outcome or development results. But for us, the G7+, we are in a formative stage in terms of getting together, organizing ourselves rather than being discussed by somebody else. We discuss among ourselves That's why we put a lot of emphasis on South-South learning process. Knowledge is a powerful tool for us. That's why South Sudanese are very much wanting to hear from us, the Timor-Leste. I keep joking this to them. Timor-Leste doesn't have the export earning leading things to export to another country, but at least we do have intellectual capacity in terms of knowledge over the past 10 years dealing with our development partners, what has worked, what hasn't, and what needs to be done. And I think that's why we gain a lot of traction in terms of getting the support from you, our colleagues, from development partners, civil society, and also the academia. Just watch out that after the G7 Plus, we will be discussing 3 things in Juba next week. One is on our own policy, and the other one is on our own governance structure, and the third one is on our communication strategy. So how do we bring this to reach out and then networking and doing some outreach activities with you so that we can tap in the knowledge and expertise that you have so that we can also keep ourselves. And the final point, ladies and gentlemen, is that, as I keep repeating myself here, that we don't want to be fragile forever. But we want to be a country that is proud of serving the citizens in a transparent, in an inclusive, and also in a mutual partnership based on trust. That's what we want. And Timor-Leste, through its own strategic development plan, we have already said that by 2030, Timor-Leste will move to at least a middle-income country, because of our resource and things. So resource mobilization, generating the revenues and services will continue to be the most powerful subject within the G7+. Why? Because no matter how rich you are, at the end of the day, it is the people that matters. It is the people that you are going to serve when you are in office or not. That's what I take away from this meeting as well. So once again, thank you very much and for all those comments, positive comments. It just energizes and motivates us in our fine line in terms of navigating in these very complex words, I have to say. Koen would agree with me that we are now thinking of involving the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In fact, last week at the Working Party, we spent hours and hours and appeasing our colleagues from Brazil, because Brazil is not is very much in opposition to the Working Party on aid effectiveness, and now they are on board as well. So I think within the context of global partnership for development effectiveness, we fragile states, we can play with the help of our partners from the international dialogue. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much, and also to the other panelists as well. David,